In this assignment, we're going to recreate some of the characters from Night in the Woods, or you're going to create one of the characters from Night in the Woods. I've created May here. This will be the only character that you can't make because I've already done it and I'm going to provide the resources. And I have a folder full of reference for the other characters. We've got a simple environment here where I've just made some leaves that pop up into the air when you pass by them, so you can see how fast you're going. And you can see the character can idle, can move, and can jump. And there are a number of different animation clips playing when she jumps. I actually didn't take the time to very carefully alter the way that the character's legs are bending. I just used the default, but hopefully will look a little bit better than that. There are ways to alter that, and I will demonstrate how to do it. So let me show you really quick some of the guts of how this works before we get into a full process. Here's the player. They are just a capsule collider. You can see bones here. There are packages that you can load, 2D animation tools that I'll show you how to use. You may notice that the background changed. I have a simple script to turn on the sky because it was annoying. I kept selecting the sky by accident, so I just let a script do that. Also for the leaves, I have a script that will spawn leaves and some behavior for them. You'll have the scripts that you can look through if you really want to see them. Underneath the player, we have a player animation object. This is something that I like to do typically because it separates all of the visuals from all of the simulated aspects. So this object has the collider, the rigid body, the script, all of that. And then this is only responsible for how the character looks. So it has the animator and all of the animatable pieces, which you probably saw in our last tutorial. And then we also have bones this time, which is a special way to control the position and deformation of certain objects. So I could open up this whole thing, but you'll see it soon enough inside of our player that we're going to look through as we animate. Down here in the asset folders, we've got script, scenes, prefabs, post-processing, which is causing a little bit of bloom just to get the style right, physics materials, import and animations. Import is where we put our sprites, and it will be this that is our first portion of work for this project. We're going to create the sprite sheet that will allow us to assemble the character. There's two ways to do this. You can either make each sprite individually and import them one at a time, which is convenient for editing them if you have to, or you can import an entire sprite sheet and chop it up into pieces, which is what I've done here, and I will demonstrate how to do both of those. Just as a little aside, you can see the leaves for the ground down here as well, which have been chopped up in a sprite sheet. Okay. Just to show you how the animator is looking right now, we've got a movement tree, which is blending based on X position velocity, or X velocity rather. We've got a jump tree, which is blending based on Y velocity, and also is activated when grounded turns on and off. So this would be falling downward through the air, being in suspended midair, and jumping upward through the air. And then I've got one special clip for landing so that there's an impact because it felt a little empty without it. We also could have put a state over here for taking off from the ground, but since I have a near instant liftoff from the ground, I just included that in the first part of the blend because it's very unlikely that your character would go back up into the air, such as being propelled upward by a fan or something like that. If that were the case, then I would have to change that situation, but right now it'll work just fine. And this is how the entire animator looks and the exposed parameters. Down in animation, if we select the player, we can't see any animations. If we select player anim, then you can browse through all the available clips and play them one at a time. And this is something you'll be able to do because I'm going to give you the entire collection of animations. So here's her run cycle. We've got an idle. And then some of them are a little bit weirder. So if we look at jump up, for instance, so it looks like that, which is very, very odd. Because we start from this position and come up to here and it doesn't loop. And that's because it's not meant to. This is just a transition and we're never going to see it again. I could create a second cycle between here and here, or just by duplicating this clip and editing it so that we can have upward traveling animation. But in this case, like I said, we don't need it. Then we've got midair. I probably should add a little ambient motion in there, like wiggling hair and ears, but it turns out to be so brief that it's not even worth doing. And so this is an option to just have a single pose. As long as you're blending between them based on forces, it looks alive. And then we've got jump down, which is just this pose. And then finally we've got landed, which does this, and then stands back up. But by the time we're getting to this portion, it's already transitioning back to our run cycle, and so we really don't see this portion at the end. But it's another that doesn't start and end in a loop. It goes from one state to another. So that's it. That's the animation clips within Unity. And let's take a look at the reference. I've got a folder here full of Night in the Woods characters that you can choose from. If you've not played the game, then it would be worthwhile to hop online and look at a couple videos or something of the game being played, because the characters have a very limited, although smooth, kind of animation style, which is something that we would want to replicate. They appear to be made out of pieces that have bones that are flexible. That's my guess. I don't know how they actually made their characters, but it's a sufficient approach for us, and it's a nice, simple way to get into rigging for Unity. So these are some of her friends and some of her associates that she meets around the town. You can pick any one of these characters that you want, and they all move virtually identically. A couple things to point out about them. They're just single color, fill, hard edge shapes. So in a pinch, we could make this out of geometry if we really wanted to, just planes. I'm going to show you how to make these with the pen tool in Photoshop, just because that's tools that we all have available, and it's going to make it very easy. They have very little in the way of perspective, so they don't tend to rotate left and right very much, although there's the opportunity, such as with this Ankh symbol, we could scale it and move it across the chest to make it look like she's rotating, but they don't really seem to do that, and so I wouldn't worry about it. Their limbs are all sort of tubes, flexible tubes. They don't appear to have elbows or knees. They just kind of bend in U shapes, and so that's all that we're going to attempt to do. And then the one special thing that requires a little bit of consideration is their eyes. They all have these large, sort of almond-shaped eyes with very large pupils, and the pupils are usually able to move around, and that's what we're going to make possible with our rig. And we're going to mask the pupil with the face, so there's a particular order setup that you have to do to make that work for each one of these faces. And then eyelids are a different matter, although with him, you don't really have to worry about it. Okay, so that's just a little basic primer of what we're going to attempt. I also have Photoshop open here to show what your early stage planning should look like. So I downloaded this picture. I don't even really know where I would credit them if I remembered, but I don't think it's official. It could be. It says Dr. Lurking down here, so hopefully that's the person who made it, not just someone who put their name on it. And I did this to get the proportions of the character basically, so that I could sketch it out and think about what were the actions that she would need to perform. First, I was looking at what perspective I might have to draw these things in, and as I was looking at clips, realized that there's no real need to do a side view or a front view. It's a 3/4 standard view. This is an interesting thing to mention, both for limited animation and for games, in that if you make a 3/4 view of a 2D character, it can serve the purposes of a side or a front view, depending on where the eyes are looking and little changes in the head. So it's a really versatile, good pose to default to, because it handles so much of what you need a character to do. It wouldn't be implausible to assume that this is looking directly sideways to the left, or if you centered the pupils, then it could be looking directly at us to camera, or even over to the right, and with small changes on the surface, then we could satisfy all of those things. I did notice this is a cat. She didn't have a tail. I guess they just didn't include one, or maybe cats in this game just don't have tails or something, but I just wanted to make note of that, so I wrote that down. And then I also even just drew the flat and side views to show that they're kind of ugly and static compared to the 3/4, just as a point of comparison. But if you really, really needed to, then you could probably make one of those also. Down here is just a list of actions that the character could perform. Not all of these are present in the game, by the way. The character does have the capability of walking and running, depending on how far you tilt the stick on your controller. Jumping downward is a necessity. You can jump both up and down. I didn't include the mid-air pose, but it's typically needed, especially if you're going to have zero gravity in your game, or even just for the trade-off between up and down. It's a good idea to have at least a pose for that. Balancing, that's something the character can do in the game that I didn't include in mine, but it would just take a little bit of logic and some extra animation clips. The part that I don't know how they did is that the wire is flexible as you move across it, and the character's bouncing on top. Probably after a little bit of thought I could figure it out, but it's not really worth it for our demo. But it is a cool feature. The character does not have a climb up animation, but it's something that would be plausible for a platformer. I don't think there was a face away in the game. I don't remember whether or not, but it would be reasonable to give your character one of those. And then a landing pose I did include, just because if you're going to fall a good distance, especially if you're going to take damage, then a landing pose is probably necessary. Typically, though, if you've got a very, very quick, snappy platformer, you can cut out the landing pose as well. You can just go directly back to running, and it will be fine so long as the pace is fairly quick. So what I'm going to show next is how to take one of these characters. I'm actually going to demonstrate with May herself, and break them into pieces. So how to think about what are all the pieces that you're going to need. So here I've got the finished sprite sheet that I used to construct May. And first thing I want to point out is that this background color back here is just for convenience sake. I do leave it on when I'm illustrating because it's a lot nicer to look at, but it's turned off when we export the PNG because we need transparency in our background. Here is the reference image again. This time I made the size of this image first and then scaled the reference to fit within this entire square, and then illustrated sometimes on top, sometimes next to, depending on what I was trying to make. But I just stuck with a 1024 texture sheet. That's really small, by the way. I could definitely go larger, but since the only pixel relevant aspect of these pieces is the transition, the anti-aliasing on the edge here. Let me turn that off. This is the only pixel relevant stuff because there's no texture, there's no photographic detail, no nothing. 1024 was more than enough, and it still looks nice and smooth in the game. You can see when I zoom out, everything looks nice and crisp. So I was able to get away with a relatively small size. So let me briefly explain what all of these pieces are. Some of them are self-explanatory, some of them are not. These are obviously ears over here. Notice that the ear doesn't just cut off flat and straight, but there's a little bit of a bend and extra material. This is because this is going to have to slot behind the skull. And if we want it to flex and move, then we're going to want a little bit of extra material just in case it is going to poke out from somewhere. So if I just use the transform tool really quick, this center of pivot is something that we're going to have inside of Unity as well. And you want to think about where eventually that center of pivot is going to be, because our animation will essentially just be rotating, moving, and occasionally scaling things depending on what it is you're animating. So you want to think about where's that going to be, and what is the kind of motion you're going to get when you do that. You may end up placing the center of pivot outside the object so it slides across the surface a little bit. But then that will affect the way that the object can scale. Let's see here, like this. So you have to think about it a little bit, although you don't have to have totally reliant concrete details on that. You can do a little bit of experimentation. It's easy to reposition the pivot point once you're in there. Notice the skull is probably the weirdest thing, that it has eye holes in it. Those eye holes are immovable, and there's transparency behind them, and then I've got this big yellow disc behind the skull. That's because this is what I do inside of the engine. I place the big yellow disc behind that skull, and it doesn't have to be this big. You could make it smaller than that, but I just made it full size for no good reason. And then we take the pupil. Let's see if I've got it in the right order. So I don't. Right now I've got it on top of the skull and on top of the yellow bit. So here's the head in my layer stack. Here's the yellow. So I want the eye to be right in between those two so that I can get this effect, right? So with two of them, let's go ahead and just duplicate that. Oh, that didn't work. There we go. Duplicate that, and I try to line them up. So now if I grab both of them and move them, this is the way that we'll have our character look around. Now notice the red can go right outside the skull very, very easily. So we have to be careful, or we have to use some masking inside of Unity. Masking is totally possible. It's a good feature. I managed to get away without doing it, and I think you guys can too, because most of these characters' heads are big enough and we don't need to scale the pupils very much. But just moving it right to here seemed to be enough. If I wanted it to appear to go even farther, we could cheat a little bit by flattening these out and moving them to the edge. Just hit enter. Ooh, I want to grab the other one. This one. Move this one over. So now it appears that they're looking even farther. So just scaling it is enough. So I didn't think that masking was really necessary, but I'm going to undo so that we're back to how my sprite sheet looked in the beginning. We've got the mouth as a sort of object on top of the face. They don't really move their mouth to talk very much. They just kind of bob their head. I didn't even really see facial expression changing. The one thing that I did see is that they blink or they squint sometimes, and you can make as many replacement objects as you want to go directly over your eyes. This one seems to be at kind of a weird angle for some reason, but I could scale that slightly to cover it. And you could also make intermediary positions. I think that I may have eventually made partial eye open positions to use, but I can't remember now. All of these other little pieces I try to leave separate from the object, so I could have put the eyebrows directly on top of the skull drawing and just left them there. But then I wouldn't have the opportunity to move them or scale them if I wanted to. So I just left them separate. The one thing I do regret is that I didn't draw the hair thick enough, because when I tried to animate it, this little cutout always showed through. So it would have been much better to have this a little bit bigger and chunkier, just kind of a round, shape on the bottom, so that if I moved it around, it wasn't so delicate and showed its gaps so easily. So try to keep that in mind when you're doing your own, similar to the ears. This is her hips, right down here. This is her chest. Her chest I ended up putting in 1 or 2 bones in there just to flex it a little bit. The collar cutout is always covered over by her head, and so we don't really have to worry about that too much. We've got her boots. I have her boots in 2 pieces, the sole and the neck of the boot. And here's another place where I wish I had been a little bit more generous in how I overlapped them, because the boot was a little hard to pose. I could easily have put a small circular bulge here at the ankle or a circular bulge here on the boot, and either way it would have been a little bit easier to pose, but I wanted to have a maximum amount of pinching and stretching, so this is what I ended up with, and it turned out to be fine. This is her hand, just free floating, same color as appears on her limbs. This is a leg. I ended up just needing 1 leg because we put bones in it and then it can pose in whatever position. I also ended up only needing 1 arm, but initially I had made a bent arm and a straight arm, and was intending to make 3 or 4 more replacement arms, but that was a bad idea, and I realized that quick enough to just revert to the straight arm. The reason I've got straight arms and legs is because that's the ideal pose for rigging your limbs with bones, so that they'll bend and flex nice and smoothly. And so I just ended up needing the straight arm and just duplicating it for the front and back. I was also going to, if we bring the picture back up, I was also going to dim, oh, that's hard to see. I was going to dim the back version of the leg and the arm and make a second copy. But what I found is that Unity's ability to tint its sprites was good enough. And so I would make 1 leg, duplicate it, complete with bones, and then just turn the sprite color down a little bit, I think towards a slightly darker blue. And so both of the back facing limbs are a little bit darker. I do still have Unity open, so I can show that real quick. I'm going to deselect, there we go. So you can see the back leg's a little bit darker and the back arm is a little bit darker. If I select them, let's see, I'm going to have to open up and find the arm. There's 1 arm. There's the other arm. Okay. I don't actually see any difference So their color is not different. I wonder, did I actually do this or am I hallucinating? I couldn't be. It's got to be something that's actually happening because I'm looking at it right now. Oh, right. I used a shader for this. So rather than change the sprite color, now I'm thinking, why didn't I just change it with the sprite color? That would have been much smarter. But I used a shader, so I've got a back sprite shader, and I've got a front sprite shader. So the front sprite shader is the default, which is just white. The back sprite shader is blue, and now that I'm saying that out loud, that's a dumb idea. You just need one shader, and then all you have to do is change this color. You don't even have to animate this color. Just pick a color. It'll be saved down here in the swatches if you want to, and then just apply it to all your back limbs, and you're done. So that was a bad idea, a way that I did it in what would be a non-optimal way. You don't want more materials for something as frivolous as that, but it does work, like either way. There are a lot of things that you can do that you shouldn't necessarily do, options. For instance, I could have just plain color sprites and then trim out their exact shape within Unity in the inspector. I could make polygon objects for all of these. Those are not really smart ways to work, but they're options that in a pinch, sometimes they can save you. Okay? So hopefully the way that this character sheet is set up makes sense to you, because what we're going to have to do is work through one of the other characters to break them up into all these particular pieces. And I'll do some short demonstration about actually constructing these, but it's going to be largely up to you to build them. One small note about their layout before we go to the next part is to try to make sure that in general, the shape that each of these pieces occupies could be contained by a full rectangle. Full rectangle is one of the options for trimming sprite sheets in Unity, and it is a more efficient, faster method of trimming. We can do lots of very detailed trimming. Like for instance, I could cut out just one of these wrinkles from this eyebrow shape, or just one of these whiskers from the mouth shape. But unless you really have to, you shouldn't try to do that. So in each case, if I try to surround one of these pieces with the rectangular marquee tool, I should be able to do it without overlapping any other sprite. And that's something that I want you guys to aspire to as well. In this case, for this sheet, this is a very spread out casual sheet. It's not super optimized and tight or anything like that. But ideally, you wouldn't want to waste this much space. You'd want it packed a little bit more tightly, but you do want to always be able to surround it with an uninterrupted rectangular marquee that doesn't require other objects to be selected at the same time. So just an example of doing this the wrong way. If I put this whisker shape really close to that ear, now I try to surround this ear, I can't get it. I can't select just the ear. I end up getting parts of the whiskers, okay? So a solution to that would be either rotating this ear so that this edge is upright or moving them further apart. Just kind of like playing Tetris with these illustrated pieces, okay? But for our cases, since this is the first time making a sprite sheet, don't be too careful or don't be too exact about it. Spread them out, get them nice and casually spaced, make it easier on yourself rather than trying to pack them in very, very tightly. All right, so now we're going to take a look at converting one of those concept images into usable pieces. All right, so here I've just got a blank Photoshop document. I just cleared out all the contents from my previous example and left in the reference image. But let me recommend first the size of document that you should be working at. I chose 1024 pixels, and then I set the resolution. Actually doesn't matter. I don't know why I even changed that, because pixels are absolute. So 1024 pixels by 1024 square. Square is a really good idea, especially in game development when you're making sprite sheets and textures, because it's a more optimizable size. Also, power of 2 sizes tend to be preferred. Power of 2 sizes mean any multiple of 2 or any square of 2. So 2, 4, and then 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, which is where we are, and 2048, sorry. And then past that, they tend to abandon that in favor of just round numbers. So like 4K, for instance. There are a number of more reasonable sizes in there. 1024 is a good one. 2048 is a good one. 512 is. Anything bigger or smaller than that, you're talking about something that's either very high resolution or very low. So I'm going to recommend that you guys also work at 1024 pixels, even though it's fairly small. It'll make sure that your character pieces are approximately of the same scale as mine. And when you import your reference into this sheet, if it's completely differently sized than the one here, just scale it. Just make sure that you don't distort it as you scale it. So for instance, I'll just drag in this one. And so you can see it locks itself to the maximum size right away. But comparing the characters side by side, I'd say I'd like it a little bit bigger. Probably about here would be okay for all of those pieces. It doesn't matter if the total character fits on the canvas as long as the pieces will, and they clearly will. I think this character was a little bit taller than May. It might have been even bigger than that, something like this. That's sort of up to you. We can change the size of the capsule collider or just the position when we use it, but it's not really going to make a big deal if there's slight differences in stature. So just scale it so that it fits properly and that you can illustrate on top of it, and then move it around to trace over those pieces or draw right next to them, depending on your preference. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer. I'm going to show you how to use the vector tools, which include the pen tool here, because they're going to give us a nice sharp outline and an editable shape in case we didn't quite make the shape correctly. We can fix it. So I'm going to go ahead and just zoom in on this, and I've got my new layer here. When I select the pen tool, look up at the top. There's different modes for the tool. We've got shape, path, and pixels, which I actually can't select right now, which is interesting. I'm not sure why. But shape is the preferred one that I use. Shape is going to create a new layer, a shape layer. It's going to be filled uniformly with whatever color you have selected up here. And if you have a stroke, then the thing that you draw will have that color and size of stroke. I have stroke turned off. You do that by selecting this red strike through square. And fill right now is white. But we could sample any color that we want right now. In fact, we could mix a color right here, or we could just sample directly from the image to get our color. And that's what I recommend that you do, because that's going to make it the easiest. So I'll just grab her fur color, say okay. And now our shape layer is ready to go. What we can do for a lot of these shapes is use a basic shape instead of the pen tool. Just note that if you click and hold on the pen tool, you get lots of different options. Freeform pen tool would be just draw the shape yourself. Curvature pen tool I've never even used. These last three are all accessible with pressing down hotkeys while you're using the default pen tool. So I just recommend that. But just below, we've got this line. We've got rectangles, rounded rectangles, ellipses, triangles, polygons, and then custom shape, which there's a collection of them and you can make them yourself. So for a lot of these characters, you could just start with an ellipse or a rectangle and then modify it. So for instance, her head is literally just an ellipse with ears stuck on and hair stuck on. But for like her hips and body, we'll do that as an example really quick because it's a slightly better shape. I'm going to just use an ellipse to start off with. So something like, I'm going to try to copy the shape. While I'm drawing the shape, if I hold down Shift, it constrains to a perfect circle. If I hold down Alt, then it draws from the center, like that. And so I'm just going to copy the shape, something like that, and then I can hold down Control to move it into position. And let's close that. That's distracting. Just like this. You could turn off the fill while you're doing it, but then your shape will appear to disappear, and that's not very nice. So I'm just going to place it right there. So now inside of this shape layer, right, I want to select the pen tool. And now if I hold down Control, it'll let me select individual vertices. I have shape into a regular path. I guess that's fine. I actually didn't know that was going to happen. Should be fine. Yeah, okay, I guess because I used a shape. Now this is just a shape layer, just a path, so that's okay. So I can move this wherever I want, holding down Control. And if I continue holding down Control, I can alter these handles. And this is very much like the graph editor in Maya. In fact, it's the same thing. These are Bezier handles. Just like that. So we can make this a very specific shape. If I think that's a little bit off, I can rotate it. Now, if we want to change the handles entirely, we can, instead of holding down Control, if you hold down nothing, you get the ability to remove points or add them to the line like that. And if you hold down Alt, you'll get this little sort of triangle without a third side. And that lets you fundamentally change the kind of point that we're dealing with. So all of these are smooth Bezier handles. If I just click, now this is a sharp point like you would find on a triangle or a rectangle. So there are no handles at all. If I click and drag, then it becomes a smooth point again. Keep in mind there's two directions. There's this one, which is the correct direction for this shape. And there's this one, which is the incorrect direction. You don't want to do that. And then once we have handles, if I hold down Alt and hover over the handle itself, then I can break the handles. And I can make them into these sharper shapes. So we can make wave shapes, well, eventually wave shapes if I'm a little bit more careful about it. Let's move this, or there we go, wave shapes like that. Or you can make heart shapes or whatever sort of thing you want. And then if you don't like it, just hold down Alt again, click or drag, and your handle is back to unified tangents Bezier handles. Okay, so that's how you deal with the pen tool. We can also draw entirely new shapes like this. It will create a new shape layer oftentimes. If it doesn't, then we can combine the two shapes and use subtraction or addition on them. Let's see. There doesn't appear to be that mode. I might be thinking of a different mode for using this tool, but sometimes you're able to treat these as subtracting from one another. It appears that it's not doing it this time, so I think I'm probably thinking of the paths instead. So don't worry about that. We won't concern ourselves. You're going to get a different layer each time. So stick with one shape at a time. It'll make it the easiest. So if we wanted to trace out her whole body shape right here, treating it as if her whole body was one illustration, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this path to add a point. I'm going to move it over to the edge of her t-shirt and then hold Alt and click. Hold Alt and click here so I get a nice sharp transition. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Alt and click. Add a point. Hold down Control to move it. Alt and click to sharpen it. And move these points somewhere up her body. And so I'm just getting these into the correct position before I shape them. The reason I have both of these being sharp is because I don't want a handle that's curving this tiny little line here. I'm just going to use this one down here. So by holding Alt and dragging, I can drag this way out to try to get the right shape, but it doesn't quite do it. Like if you could see there, it was a little bit too round. I'll just hold it right here. And we need to be a little bit more square. So if I do hold down Alt and drag these, you can see one side of it is very loopy. I'll go ahead and zoom way in. One side of it's very loopy. The other side is much closer to what I want. So then I'm going to hold down Alt and drag this handle and just aim it towards the other point to get a generally straight line. Just don't go beyond it or too far. So now I've got this one to play with. Ooh, just misclicked there for a second. I've got this one to play with, and I've got this side to play with. So I can make the two of them combine to just the right silhouette, just like that. Same thing sort of needed over here. I'll go ahead and drag this out. Make sure you're going the right way. Drag one handle to just face the other point, and then this one is free to play with, or I can hold down Control to drag this one so that I don't end up breaking this smooth tangent here. I'm going to drag that out a little bit, and then drag this one down a bit too. And there we go. We've got a nice smooth shape. Keep in mind, this is not how I drew the sprite sheet the first time. I separated the upper body from the lower. That's a better idea. I'm just doing it for an example. Okay? So what we're going to need to do then is shape this whole egg going up into her shoulders, but notice that we don't see where this ends up here. It's a good idea when making pieces that are going to become a puppet in Unity to make just a little bit too much. So I'm actually going to put this top right up here as if her shoulders were rounded, kind of smoothly transitioning from one to the other. Because if I want to move my head around, scoot it left and right, up and down, scale it larger and smaller, that's going to give me a little bit of forgiveness in the appearance of the character and just overall make my life a bit easier. I'm going to also move this a bit further down, rotate it just a bit. Same thing over here. I'm going to smooth out these tangent handles, move this into a better position like right there. I may even want to add this one. Let's see which direction is that going. So this one will go straight. This one is angling upward. So that'll help me to shape out the side of her body a little bit. I can turn this off and on to see how close I am, or we could always turn off the fill. We can still see the red outline, and then we can turn it back on again by selecting the most recent color. Is going to be the one that you just used. So that's close enough for our purposes right there. We've got one nice shape. If we use our movement tool, we can place it wherever we want on our sprite sheet, or we can just turn the visibility off and keep illustrating. Something to make you aware of is that oftentimes you're going to probably want to mask one shape into another. A great example of this is the limbs. We want a nice smooth limb. This is actually why I illustrated it bent for the first portion, and then I made a pill shape later. But notice how the sleeve is perfectly lined up. We don't see any blue. It just cuts the thing in half. I'm going to use this t-shirt as an example where I'm going to make the bottom. In fact, I've got the wrong color, don't I? I should make it gray. So here we are on the shape layer. I'll go ahead and select the gray of the pants. There we go. And then I want this orange on the top half of it. It's like, okay, well, what do I do for that? I'm just going to make a rectangle shape and just drag it out like this. So it made a new shape layer. And then I'm going to select the color, and I already happen to have the orange right here, so I'm just going to pick it, but we could color pick again. And now I'm going to take my pen tool and just select a corner and move it so that it's at that slight angle. Yeah, I'll convert it. Notice how big this is, though. It's going to cover the entirety of the upper body, and that's good. I'm going to take the lower body and move it back into place and zoom in. Okay, try to get it nicely positioned, something like that. And I'm going to make this top portion a clipping mask by right-clicking that layer and create clipping mask. So now, wherever I move this top layer, it's only visible where there's pixels, or shape in this case, on the lower layer. So look at that. I can line it up really nicely with this edge of the t-shirt, and then go ahead and grab this vertice and move it up. Bingo, we've got it. And if we needed a curved line, then we could just use the Bezier handles to do that. But we've got essentially one big piece if we group this. Here we go. One big piece that we can treat as a single object that has two different colors in a single shape. Okay? And you can continue putting things in this group if you want to include the decal and the neck loop, for instance, and make it one big sprite that you could move around. Or if we do want to break it into multiple sprites, then that wouldn't have been the way that I would go about it. Instead of illustrating the entire thing, I would illustrate just the bottom and just the top as I did on my other example. Okay? So hopefully that gives you some idea of how to begin. Besides shapes, there are also strokes on our characters. Oftentimes they're going to be things like small details or the mouth. Let me show you really quickly that we can use the pen tool in that way as well. I'm just going to zoom in on her face, make a new layer just in case. I actually don't think you have to, but I'll do it. Pen tool. And now up here at the top, I'm going to remove the fill and tell the stroke to be the color of these lines. And so we can mix. I think it's the same as the eyes, so I'll just click here. So I've got no fill, but I do have stroke. Right? And so I'm going to click, 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 click like that. It's pretty hard to see, but there we go. There's the line. You can see that the line is far too thin. I'll go ahead and let's turn down the opacity of the reference so we can see the difference there. And I'll slide my object just a little bit to the right. Okay, so you can see, we'll put it all the way over here, that they do look somewhat different. Okay, when you have the pen tool selected on your shapes layer, these options come back up here. But there's more than just the shape. There's also the size to be considered. So we want to try to match that. But notice how sharp this line is also. Sometimes we can alter that. I know in Illustrator there's lots and lots of settings. In Photoshop we've got somewhat less settings than that. Do we have more? What do we have? Okay, we can make dashed lines. We can use presets. That's cool. But what I'm really looking at are these three options down here at the bottom when I click this line. I want the alignment, the caps, and the corners. The alignment, if you really wanted the line to only sit inside or outside your shape, you could do that. In this case, it's going to look really stupid. I guess that one's fine, but usually I just leave it in the middle. The caps, though, are going to change how the line ends. So now here's a soft line ending, and how the corners are treated. They can be chiseled corners, or they can be round corners. And now that's the way her face looks. So we want to make sure to change those settings when we're trying to get this exact. Now the only thing left for me to do would be to get the exact contours, because I didn't really bend this line the way that it's drawn. I just clicked. When you are drawing a line, if you click and drag, it will make a smooth corner. And if you single click, it will make a sharp corner. So let's see if it allows me. I'll just draw a new one. Click, 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 sharp. Okay. And then if I click, click and drag, click and drag, click and drag, it will make curvy lines. But we can edit these after the fact, so there's no need to make it the first time. I'm going to hold down Control like I just did to select a corner, hold down Alt, and now I can drag out this line to bend it. So it looked like her face line was going just a little bit that direction, like this, and a little bit this direction. And I may even have gone too far with that. Let's bring it down just a little bit. I think that's what I saw. So let me go ahead and select this. Oop, there we go. Yeah, I went a bit too far. I can see now that I've moved it aside. So I'm going to take the handle, move it back quite a bit. This one just a little bit. I may want to alter this one instead. So sometimes it's hard to alter the starting or ending vertex. So what you could do is click on one, click on the other to complete the shape, then do your alteration, and then delete that portion of line, which is something we can do. So I'm going to grab this, make that bend up just a little. And so now if I use my selection tool and select a portion of this line like that, and hit delete, then I can get rid of it and it still retains its handles. So now I can put this back right like that. And I think that maybe it needs to be slightly bigger. We'll settle on 8 pixels up here. There we go, just a tiny bit bigger than it was. So you can use that method to construct any of the details on the character. If there are several like these, you can do these on separate layers and group them, or you can even merge them so that they become pixels because you don't really need to edit them all that much. So there you go, ways to make your silhouette shapes with flat colors and ways to make the strokes. None of these characters have gradients, none of them have photographic textures, so that should really be all that's necessary in terms of drawing. All you have to do then is arrange them into a big sheet, but I do recommend drawing them over the character on a reference layer to make sure that you get the right proportions and size. You can turn their opacity down, just like I've done to make it easier, and then just turn the layers off one by one as you construct, and eventually then scoot them all out into a big sprite sheet layout. Hopefully that's enough to get you started. The next part that I would have to cover is how to take that sheet then, import it into Unity, and slice it up into individual sprites to use. So there was one extra thing I wanted to show before we import into Unity, which is that the cleanliness of your outlines really does matter, especially since there's an automatic method of slicing up your assets, which is very quick, and that can go haywire if you don't do nice, clean silhouettes. So here's the finished sprite sheet that we'll be using for May, assuming that we went through all of those steps and illustrated all the pieces that we want. You can come back later and tweak some of these pieces just a little bit and fix it in the import. This square was actually for making the eyelids go half lidded from either the top or the bottom. I just took the same color and just duplicated it right here. You can add things in the blank areas and cut up extra sprites. It is a little bit fraught because you may accidentally delete previous sprites, but as long as you're careful, it should be fine. But I wanted to demonstrate on this little blank square here that if you do silhouettes that don't have a nice clean line, that are a little bit smudgy, then it can cause problems. So here at the top, I've got a slightly transparent brush. I'm just going to fill in this kind of circle as nicely as I can by hand and slice out a little bit with an eraser too. So I'm going to try to be semi-careful, not making too many issues, but you can already see little bits of semi-transparent material up there. So then I'm going to come up and just get like a hard transparent eraser and just erase out like a couple little slices here to see if that's going to be sufficient. And then I'm also going to get a completely hard, so let's just do an ink brush over here. And over in this corner, I'll do the same thing. This one has no semi-transparency. It's just on or off. And then I'll also grab an eraser, hard eraser instead of transparent, and then just chunk out a few pieces to see what sort of effect that we get from that. So with those two done, then I'm just going to save as a PNG, which is what you'll need to do. So I'm going to go right up on my desktop, save it as a PNG. Now, the reason I'm saving a PNG, by the way, is because this supports not only transparency, but colored transparency, whereas a GIF does not. And if you're not already aware, JPEG does not support transparency. So of all of the available formats, I would suggest a PNG as the first one to go to. You can use default source files like Photoshop files in Unity. It's smart enough to ask the program that made it to import it for you. So if you use a PSD file, it will use Photoshop or try to refer to Photoshop to open that file and transform it into something Unity can use. I typically try not to use that feature though, because if you're going to give your art assets to someone who doesn't have Photoshop, like a programmer or a game designer might not have Photoshop, then you run the risk of them not being able to import it again. But maybe I'm just paranoid. So I'm just going to call this just test sheet. So with that saved, then I'll be able to import that one and this one both into Unity to show you what the import features look like. All right, so here we have Unity open, and I already have all of the folders that are appropriate for this project in here. But know that if you made a blank project, then this process would work just as well. I typically like to have an import folder, and then inside that import folder, there might be other subfolders, but this is just where I stick everything that I drag into the project, which is meant to be a character, a prop 3D model, or in this case, sprite sheets. You don't always have to drag every texture into this folder, but it helps. I actually have leaves in here in silhouette and white so that they can be colored. And then because I wanted it to be a sprite, I just made a blank ground, just white sprite so I could color it however I wanted to. So here is the one that I've already imported, and it already has a sprite sheet, which I'll show really quickly just because the import settings are somewhat relevant. That the texture type needs to be a sprite, the sprite mode multiple. Pixels per unit I set to 256, and I recommend that you use the same setting because it will try to scale the character approximately as we see it in our environment already. Mesh type tight rather than full rectangle is better just because we have the ability to change it if we really need to. Extrude edges I just don't change. I turn generate physics shape off because we don't want that on just a character. The only physics shape is a capsule for the entire character. And then other than that, that's pretty much it. And you can hit apply when you've done all that. So let's run through it with both our test sheet, which I'm just dragging and dropping in now, or the test sheet for May, which is the same. I just named it different so I can go through the steps again. First, I just drag them both in. You can see when I highlight them, it gives me the name down here in a preview. Okay. And there's all these little arrows next to these assets. And right now, if I click that arrow, I just get a duplicate of whatever the contents are, except in the case of the already set up sheets. In this one, I get one of each of the sprites, and you can see them all previewed here. They all have their own names, although I didn't spend much time on the names for the most part. This one's chest, decal, ear. Some of these are not set up as well. Make character 13 is like the automatic name. But you can see how well each one of these has come through one at a time by just clicking through them. So, oh, it looks like I have the nose separate from the whiskers. That's funny. I didn't even remember that I'd set up that functionality, but I guess I did. So that's one way that you can see how well these things have come through is just by clicking this arrow to preview those sprites. And in fact, when you use them in the scene view, it's by opening this and grabbing a particular sprite and dragging it in, and that is its own object. Okay. So let's look at the test sheet first. It's a sprite. Sprite mode single, I'm going to set it to multiple. Pixels per unit, we'll set it to 256, just like our character. Mesh type tight, don't generate physics shapes, and then we hit apply. Okay. That is just to change all of the settings. Notice the arrow went away because I haven't changed any settings in the sprite editor yet. So it knows it's going to have multiple sprites, but it doesn't know where those sprites are. So right now it's non-functional. After we do that step and hit apply, we go to the sprite editor. And we take a look in here and we say, okay, what do we do? Well, what we need to do is up at the top, there are a few modes: the sprite editor, custom outline, physics shape, skinning, and secondary textures. Skinning may not be available for you yet because there's a package that makes that available that will load up in the next section. Right now we're in the sprite editor, and then we want to go to slice, and we have to determine our slicing type. Automatic will try to detect what is and is not a solid shape and cut it up. And then we've got other ones like grid by cell size, which we could determine by inputting things in here, or grid by cell count, which is nice if you have a uniform like pixel animation or a sprite sheet that's meant to be animated and it's chopped up evenly. So I could tell it that we have, for instance, 2 columns and 2 rows, and slice. And now what's happened, it's hard to see, but when I hit that, oh, it left out the blank ones. That's kind of nice. Let's open like that. So it made 1 sprite here and 1 sprite here. Now, hitting this alpha button up in the top here that turns off full color is a way to see the mess that I'm referring to when you don't have clean silhouettes. All of this semitone here and here could potentially make it look different in the game, but also you could get little crumbs that are kind of floating away from your sprite and really mess up the ability for this to chop things up. So instead of using grid, I'm going to use automatic and just see what we get. I'm not really sure. And then I'll turn this on to see. So we actually got 3. We got this one, which is kind of a nice cookie shape. And then we got these 2 because I sliced this completely in half. And so it's actually treating that as 2 separate shapes. We can do anything we want to a slice once we've got it, including resize it, reposition it, change the pivot point, and name it. And so if we wanted this to be 1 sprite, what I'd do is grab this one and hit delete, grab this larger one, and then scale it. There are green scale handles and there are blue ones. The green ones are for trimming the shape of this sprite smaller. So this is the total area, and then this will cut just a bit of it, or it's actually for setting the tiling. Try not to mess with those green ones for now until you have an idea of what they do. And instead, see if I try to scale it out from this green one, it won't work. I have to actually grab from the bar, the blue bar over here. So that will make this the entire shape. It's okay if you go a little bit over, it's not really a big deal. Then we could set the pivot point. Let's say I want this to pivot from this Death Star opening up here, and then we'll just call it Death Star. Why not? And you always have to hit apply before you exit this window, otherwise your edits won't be saved. So we hit apply. This one will take on the name of the sprite and then give it a number. So it's called test sheet 0. And that's what all of your sprites will be named: 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., unless you give them a name. Okay. So I'm going to exit that, and now we should be able to see here is our Death Star, and here's our test sheet object. If I put this out here, you can see that it appears fairly nice. You can kind of see the ghostly remnants of those brush strokes there, just a little bit. But really not too bad. That would be kind of acceptable. And then the Death Star shape, you can see that the rotation center is right where I put it, right there. Whereas for this one, it is just right in the middle. So let's look at the test May sheet so that we can actually do this correctly. Same thing, sprite 2D, change the pixels per unit to 256, and the sprite mode to multiple. Notice we've got polygon as well in there. Turn off generate physics shapes, and everything else is pretty much fine. One note, if you had pixel art as opposed to illustrated art, you'd want to change this filter mode to point so that your pixel art wouldn't be blurry. But for full illustrated art, bilinear is just fine. We hit apply. So now that arrow has disappeared because we need to go into the sprite editor. Here in the sprite editor, we can see all of the pieces. Okay. And because this is so cleanly illustrated, we can pretty much just use automatic slicing to start off with. Pivot point in the center by default. This method, delete existing, just means that if you did a second slicing pass, all of your previous slices would be gone. And that's usually preferable. So let's hit slice. Close that. Close that. And then I like to hit this just to see where the outlines are because I can't see it over the transparency box. And here we've got all of the different squares chopped up. Most of them are fine, some of them are not. So up here, we've got 3 for the eyebrows instead. What I just did there, by the way, is create a new sprite when I just clicked and dragged. If you do that by accident, to reselect it, just click inside of any square. That selects it for editing. And if you want to delete it, just select it and then hit the delete key. So really, we don't want these brow ones. I'm deleting all of those. And we don't want all of these whisker ones for sure. And I'm just going to get rid of the mouth one because for these 2 shapes, I want to just drag my own. Click and drag. Try to keep it fairly tight. But of course, you can adjust it after the fact. Like this. So that I have one big sprite for the mouth. Then I can set the pivot point. One good step before you stop editing any one of these sprites is to give it a name. Because if you don't, in your animation editor and in your hierarchy, they're going to have all of these repetitious names that look almost exactly the same. And that's going to be hell, and you're really going to regret it. Hit apply whenever you want to save your changes. And then we can see what things look like in our project view. So this is the test May object. If I look at that, I've got mouth, which I just made, and then test May 0, test May 1, test May 2, test May 6. That's how these things will be listed in your animation sheet. Don't let that happen. You will regret it, okay? Name them. So let's go back to our import PNG, Sprite Editor, and then come in and take a look at each of these and make sure their size is correct, they're encompassing the right thing, and that their pivot point is set at an intelligent place, okay? All of those things together. This is the eyelid shape, eyelid, and eyelid, I'm going to call it eyelid slide because I have a second eyelid. And the pivot point is right in the middle right now, which is probably fine, but I would actually prefer it to be in the middle bottom, right about here, because I need to scale it a little bit. So it might need to get bigger and smaller to not go outside the head. So something like that, so it becomes a curtain. You do have options down here at the bottom to set the pivot at bottom right, bottom center, bottom left automatically. So bottom center in this case would be fine. You don't have to hit apply every time, but until you hit apply, nothing has been changed. So if you keep working for a while, then hit apply, you run the risk of losing some of your edits. So it's worthwhile to hit that fairly frequently. I'll turn this off for a moment so I can see the full color version of things. My ears, I want them to pivot from inside the skull a little bit so they travel across the skull like that. And I just want to name them ear left like that, ear right, move the pivot point like that. The skull, I tend to just leave the skull pivot point right in the center usually. Or if I kind of know where the neck is going to be, try to position it vaguely in the area of the neck. Something like here kind of makes sense for this one. I'm going to name it skull or head. This one right here is just the backing, so we just call it like eye backing. And the pivot point doesn't matter for that because it's just going to sit forever behind there. Here we've got a pupil. Pivot point for that right in the center because we might scale this bigger and smaller to dilate the eyes. Same thing with the eyelid. So we've got lid. Just call this one solid. And I'll leave the pivot point alone. The hair, probably the pivot point should be a little bit lower down here. So if you scale or rotate, it slides across the head. We can call that hair. If you want to put a prefix on all of these like May hair, May skull, you can, but I find that there's no reason to because it's already going to be inside of a single character with the proper name. You're not going to need to differentiate at that level, so I tend to just not do that. Here the hips I like to leave right in the middle, but the chest I like to put the pivot point down kind of where the shirt is so that it sort of slides around on top of the hips a little bit better. We'll call this chest. And in fact, we're going to use bones for the setup of some of these things later on. So this pivot point setup might end up being moot, like in the case here, where I'm no longer going to use that pivot point. I'm actually going to use bones later on. So here the wrist, I'll put it down towards the origin of the hand. Notice I've only got one hand. We'll duplicate it. The boot meant to rotate from back here in the corner. That would be boot top. And then the sole of the foot, if it's going to rotate from anywhere, it'll probably rotate from the same sort of place down here. Let's say boot sole, like that. So we're coming along pretty nicely. That one can stay the same. We'll just call that decal. This one, did I ever remake that one? I didn't. I'm going to hit apply so I don't lose any edits. I didn't ever make the brow shape, so I'm just going to encompass that. Pivot point's just fine, but I'll call this brow. Okay, let's see how are we coming along. So we've got the arms and legs. Those are definitely going to be set up with bones, so I'm just going to skip their setup. This one I didn't end up using at all, really. So we're pretty much close to the end. I'm going to hit apply, close this window, and this sometimes is a better way to check because now we can see what's named and what's not named. Now it's coming through. See all that stuff. And then we want to test it in the scene. So what you do is drag the object out. If you still have my player out there, drag it out next to the player so you can see what the relative size is. Try to avoid rescaling this a lot. Try to leave it scales at 1. Instead, if you find that your character is wildly different in size, come back to the import settings and change the pixels per unit. So watch what happens if I change this to like 100, which was the default. Now the object is this size, but it's still scale at 1, which is convenient because that can act as a default. Okay, so if you drag your stuff in and you find, oh no, this is way, way too big, then it's probably because your import settings were not set properly. 256, apply, and now they're the right size again. Okay. So here I've got the hips and the chest on top of that. There we go. And if I hit my rotate key, then I can kind of see how that's going to end up flexing and moving. And I can start assembling the character to see how well I did. There we go. Okay. Now all of these objects right now are appearing in the hierarchy by themselves. It will be necessary to assemble them entirely into an object. But for now, this is just the testing that we're doing to see, do we have the right illustrated objects? Can we put them in an order that makes sense on the stage? All that stuff. And in fact, you can assemble, quote unquote, your object without even needing to create a hierarchy at first. And then we can slot them into a hierarchy second and put them into the player third. So you can do that stuff. So for instance, here's the eye backing. Let's look at this problem. Uh-oh, I've got a Cyclops. Okay. Now the order of drawing things is controlled over here by additional settings, sorting layer and order in layer. I'll show you that my player over here, if I just open this up, has different numbers in this order, but is using the default sorting layer. Okay, so that's going to make it easier for you guys to do it because you just stay on the default sorting layer. And our environment also uses a sorting layer. The ground is using, or is that the ground? Let's open that up. Yeah, the ground is using order 0, which should be behind everything that's a positive number. The sky is using, oh, the sky is a mesh. So the sky had to actually be moved backward. So don't worry too much about that. Okay, but our character and objects are all using the default sorting layer. So if you want things to be in front of and behind other things, then you have to change that number. So assuming that the ground is going to be 0 and we want our character to appear in front of the ground at all times, the hips should probably be something like 1. And then the chest can be 2. Then the skull could be 3. But now what should this be? So if this is 0, it's behind everything. Does that matter? Well, it might matter. Because when the two of these are moving together, it might cross over the body, and now suddenly we can see the body through there. So the backing, right, the eye backing, should probably be in front of the body, the arms, everything else. So that's going to make it like 3. And that requires that the head be something like 4. Okay. Now if I grab these two, grab them both, and move them around, the whole head still appears solid. But we're going to have another problem. We're going to put a pupil into those eyes, right? So right now it's completely behind. So I'm going to change its order and layer. You can actually left click and drag this to get more interactive. But right now there's no appropriate number really because 3 is the same as that backing. Don't use the same number if it's important they overlap correctly. You want to use different numbers. So I need the pupil to be 1 in front of the backing, 4. And then the skull now needs to be 5 in order to sort properly. And now I can take that eye and I could put it right there and I could duplicate the eye. It's okay if things that are never going to interact have the same number. So the 2 pupils should never interact. I suppose there might be an instance where we're trying to make her cross-eyed or something, but they're solid red. It's not really going to affect anything. So try to use the same number only for things that aren't really going to interact. So taking a look at our character, that means that this arm and everything to do with this arm has to have a number that's higher than the body, probably the legs, and also the head. So if I take this and move this around, you can kind of see it's overlapping the legs and the feet and the body. If I bring it up here, it's overlapping the head. It's hard to tell with the wrist and the hand, but it is. It's overlapping everything. So the numbers that I've used for that are higher than all of the other numbers for all of the other body parts. If you think about it, the rearmost object is probably this back arm. It should go behind the legs, right? If we swung it down, it should go behind the body. It should go behind the head. So that back arm is going to have the lowest numbers, the closest to 0. If I select it, and you actually have to grab the arm, not the bones, so I have to find it. Leg back, leg front, arm flat. That's a bad name. Arm back. There we go. So the arm has a sorting value of 0, so that's not great. I probably should have thought that through better. And what does the hand have? The hand has 0 as well, so I didn't think it out too well. Luckily, this character never ducks down, to touch the ground. But if she did, then it's possible that that would go through the ground and we wouldn't be able to see it anymore. So anyway, the back arm should have the lowest values, probably followed by the back leg. Then after that, the front leg probably. The front leg might need to go in front of like the shirt sometimes if you curled into a ball. So it could be the body, then the front leg and the head, and then finally in front of everything would probably be the arm. Although I think in my case, yeah, so if you shrugged your shoulder, it would go into the head. Sometimes it can be tricky because you might want that shoulder to go behind the head, but then the hand couldn't cross in front of the face or the rest of it. So, on a case-by-case basis, sometimes we might need to shuffle that stuff around. Going back to our more simple example, these objects here, we just change the number little bit by little bit and try to think it through so that you can get the right kind of function when you've fully built your character. If you do want to make a little bit of hierarchy at this point, then what you need to do is grab all of the pieces that need to fit together and give it a parent. You can either create an empty parent, but since we're doing this so simply and we've set the pivot points correct, you just want to pick the thing that should move all the other things. So the skull, in this case, should move all of the things that make up her face and her eyes and her ears and hair. So I'm just going to grab these other objects and then click and drag them to skull so that this arrow appears. So now with this drop down, it says when I move skull, then the rest of those things are children of skull. Okay? And that might happen a couple times depending on your character. You could have an elaborate hat that needs to be a child of the skull that has its own pieces that need to be children of the hat. But in this case, we're not really going to worry about that. I guess one example on my original character would be that I chopped up the nose and whiskers separate. So the whiskers would be children of the nose probably, and then the nose would be a child of the head. But in my example right here, I've just got it all as one piece. So you can place that up there, increase this value to where it's on top of all the relevant stuff. And you probably want to check, make sure that it goes over top of everything it needs to. So we place it in place, and then we can make it a child like that. We're just dragging it right up onto the original object. So when this moves, the rest of it moves. Okay. So importing and setting up your character pieces, checking that everything's right, that is your assignment. We're not going to fully rig or implement this character in this assignment. That's going to be the next assignment because it's an entirely different challenge. That will require that you use your hierarchy correctly, that we set up prefabs, that we implement the animator, and that we control the animator parameters. Okay, so that's a different thing. So what you're going to stop at is importing your character, slicing it up into pieces, putting it into the stage to make sure that it all works properly, and then potentially setting up the hierarchy. I don't really care if you do that part or not, because what we're going to check really is the sprite sheet down here. If you do that, you might save yourself a little bit of work for next week. If not, it's okay. But what you're going to export to me is your sprite sheet. I'm going to test that all of your sprites have names. I'm going to drag them into a blank scene and check their pivot points and attempt to assemble your character a little bit. That's what your homework is going to entail. So what you're going to get to me is you click on your imported PNG, right click, and do export package. There shouldn't be any dependencies. If there's a folder, that's okay that you put it inside. That's it. And you just export that and you'll give that to me as a Unity package. Okay? So that will be the homework this time. The next time we're going to set up the rest of the character so that it's a fully functioning rig, including the bones. And then we're going to animate it and apply it to this character controller that I've set up for you guys.